Hey, I'm back with this series after who knows how long. I've been meaning to get working on this for, and now we're finally doing it. And the question is whether or not the Askr trio with Air can clear all of Book 3 Lunatic by themselves. The answer? Well, you probably know, but it wouldn't make for entertaining content, or content in general, if I just told you straight up. So, the kids. I decided to change up a fair amount of stuff, mainly because, well, we're getting to more levels of power creep, and I don't think Brazens are really going to be doing much. So for Alphonse in particular, I gave him the Vulture Blade, which I think is going to pair really, really well with whatever I have on Air currently. I didn't really change her out much because I think Tamari still works, and I'm not going to refine her P or F. Either way, it's still an inheritable sword with a good stat swing if you can get the debuffs off, and it's going to be pretty easy to get the debuffs off, at least in the main story, because Air has a lot more res to work with than a lot of other generics in that mode. I also give him attack defense form so he could actually have a bit more bulk, just on the physical side, because I'm not sure if we could count on Brazens with Air around. That's why I gave Brazen to Sharena. And initially my logic was, okay, well, as long as she's not getting healed back, then it's fine. But I'm fucking stupid, and you'll see why in a bit. But regardless, I gave her Brazen initially. I gave her a Brave Lance because I wanted something a bit different than just enemy phase. And at the time, I figured we just need a bit more variation in the builds on this team, mainly because we already have Alphonse, who's just enemy phase, and then we have Sharena, who's also enemy phase. But then we have Anna, who's just our blue check. And she didn't really change much either. She still has Triangle Depth and all that jazz. Sharena and Alphonse were really the only ones I, switched around. And as a result, I decided, okay, Brave Lance is going to be the way to go. And let's just stack up her attack and her defense and yada 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 with Brazens. And it was a horrible idea in the grand scheme of things, and you'll see why again. But so that's why I initially ran with. I ran Brazen Desperation with Brash Assault, and it sure was something. And that's the team I ran with until I switched out some stuff. Chapter 1 was pretty standard. I don't think there's really going to be a lot to talk about for the first 2 to 4 chapters, mainly because this is where, it was really, really tame, and there really wasn't much going on. Even in Chapter 1, it wasn't, crazy hard. I might have had, a death or two from just being really dumb, but for the most part, it was all just generic enemies with, no skills or anything, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But even with that being the case, it was still good to just test out everything that we gave everybody. And initially, I was already seeing the issues with Sharena, because, healing, but I kept persisting that maybe, just maybe it'll work out. It didn't work out. Because when we get to Chapter 2, she is constantly failing me on every single turn. And it's unbelievable how I was thinking, yeah, this is a great idea, just giving her Brazen with somebody who heals 20 HP at the start of every turn to allies. I am the Fae player ever. And the breaking point for me was when we had to go up against Praseer near the end of Chapter 2, and she just couldn't deal any damage. And I was like, okay, maybe let's swap out our kit. And that's what I did. I decided to give her Double Death Blow instead, and then hit and run, so that way she could just get out of any sort of danger when necessary. Although it was not necessarily the most applicable in a lot of situations, but it was still very helpful when the time came. Still, that's what I decided to do, because, I need actual functioning units, and I didn't want to waste resources on Air's refine, especially since I'm just going to be sticking with Tamari at the end of the day. On the bright side, Alphonse works like a charm with this, because nothing is piercing through him. Even with, mediocre res, the debuffs that Air is inflicting, and then on top of whatever is being inflicted from Vulture Blade, it is a big stat swing. And because of that, Alphonse can actually tank a really big champ. And surprisingly, Anna's actually doing pretty well too, because she just, again, is a blue chip. She doesn't really have to do much else. And I appreciate it all the same. Then we get to Chapter 3 and 4, which are probably going to be the tamest chapters of the book. Mainly because A, you have all the beasts that have basically no effects. And B, because they all target defense, Alphonse can just shrug off most of it and just go from there. Although I use some units to do other stuff, but that's aside the point. They don't have any of their refines or anything that makes them good nowadays. I think the only remotely threatening unit was Keaton, mainly because, well, it's dual phase Brave, and he has a lot of attacks, so that makes a fair amount of sense. Still, we get through Chapter 3 and we get through Chapter 4, and it's pretty fine for the most part. But then we get to Chapter 5, and initially it starts out pretty well. You got your just standard enemies, yada yada yada. You have Richter without his refine, and all that junk, and you're fine. It's all good. But then you get to Idun's map, and it's probably the first big difficulty spike of the run because she has a stupid amount of bulk, she has a guaranteed follow-up, and she can't get debuffed, which means everything on my team just completely crumbles to her. Even Sharena, who has Brave, she doesn't hit hard enough, unfortunately, which is a problem. And I keep trying and trying to do something with this, but it doesn't work out, which means eventually I had to swap out Anna's Sacred Seal for this map in particular for Spur Attack so that I can just barely kill Idun and move forward into part 5, which was even worse because of all the reinforcements on that map. So you have Gustav and you have like a bunch of like all these Binding Blade units. Thankfully, Idun isn't there, but it was still a big pain in the ass because they're all running towards you, and a majority of them are calves. And I guarantee you, tanking Sue, even without her refine, is still going to be a pain in the ass because Sharena's blue and has no speed with her Brave Lance. Anna's not taking any hits, or she's taking one at the very most, but she needs that bulk for other stuff too. And then you have Gustav with the guaranteed follow-up and really good bulk, and you have all the mages who can actually just shred Alphons because they're not getting debuffed either. It was a pain in the ass. And how I actually figured this out? I don't actually know how I figured this out. Because I've been on this particular map for maybe like 15 minutes. And you're probably going to be looking at this footage and it's like, oh, he did it in like maybe a minute. No, it was a pain in the goddamn ass because of all the reinforcements. And if you appreciate all my efforts that I go into this, please like and subscribe and tell me how much of a goddamn idiot I am for doing this. We do eventually beat it, and we get into Chapter 6, and really, the only big one here was, like, Leth. Everybody else was still pretty tame to deal with, but Leth was still a speedy unit with a good amount of attack, so anything she initiated on the team that wasn't Alphons was going to kill, and because she's a cav, she had really good range, and either getting Alphons to body block or Sharena to initiate on her wasn't the easiest. We still managed through it, but it was still a lot better than Idun and Part 5 of Chapter 5. And even Hell's Miracle really wasn't that bad, even though it was still, again, a pain in the ass. Alphons can just shrug it off because Vulture Blade is a pretty big stat swing. But then we got into Chapter 7, and it started off pretty well. I was making some dumb mistakes with like Fallen Tiki and a couple other things, but for the most part it was relatively tame comparatively to the other chapters. Not the tamest by any means, but it was still up there in terms of tame. Until Part 5 again. Yeah, that's going to be something going forward. I'm pretty sure every chapter following just had a big pain in the ass Part 5, where there was always that one or two units, or the group of units, that just made it too difficult to do anything. For this in particular, it was Corrin with Fallen Tiki. Both had really good bulk. Corrin was a bit easier to deal with, thankfully, although she was still a pain, and this was probably one of the only times I felt really good that I wasn't running visible buffs, because if I was, it would have been even worse to deal with. Although if you were able to get rid of Corrin after, wouldn't matter too much, but since everybody moves, it means that you have to be way quicker with your actions, because Berkut could always just go in and initiate combat. You have Marita who could do the same thing, and you have Lif who could do the same thing. Although his kit's constantly changing, so it doesn't matter all too much. When everybody's moving around, it's kind of a pain to deal with. So you have to be very, very optimal with what you're doing. And me, being the smart cookie that I am, was not very optimal for who knows how long. Either way, I think the biggest issue here was just dealing with Tiki at the end, because you had to save her for last. If you were to go for her first, I don't think you can necessarily take her on, mainly because, well, she has Guard, she has Special Fighter, and Ignis, so no matter what, you're not taking any sort of special from her. She hits way too hard and for res. Even Anna with her res wasn't going to do anything, because she just also had no attack to deal with her. The best course of action was to just get a special charge for Tiki, so then we could deal with her afterward. And that was just a big pain, because again, everybody's rushing towards you, so you have to be super optimal with your plays. Eventually we figured it out, but we couldn't really chip or debuff with Air because, you know, she has a distant counter PRF. I don't know how we made it through this one either, but I would still say this was a bit more manageable than Chapter 5. And then we get to Chapter 8, which was actually pretty tame. The only one that was really giving me trouble was Yarn, but that's just mainly because he had Gale Force and I couldn't really body block all too well on some of the maps. Granted, the first 4 were pretty easy, but when you get to the final map, that's when it became a bit more of a pain in the ass, because you had Cynthia, who's a flyer, and you had Brady who could attack from range, which means you had to be way more careful with your positioning, and that's okay, because that's the name of the game anyway. And thankfully there was one spot in which you could just body block a majority of the stuff there, and then Yarn kept coming in and Gale Forcing, and that was the issue. Until he couldn't Gale Force because he could only attack once, and that was probably the key moment in which I was like, okay, I beat it. Then we get to 3 houses, and wow, 3 houses and their power creep sure was something. Even at the time, it was definitely something. The first 2 chapters, again, were pretty manageable. You could just go in, initiate combat, and run away, but thankfully this is where Hit and Run was coming into play a lot more often, but it really didn't do much in a lot of other maps. Still, I thought it was useful and I kept it. Until we got to part 3, and that's where it became a bigger pain in the ass because we had to deal with Claude. And Claude has Law Attack Speed, which means he's going to be doubling no matter what, and he's going to be hitting very consistently. And that was an issue for a bit because trying to position all your allies in a specific way while also simultaneously trying to get in, kill Claude, and get out without dying to any sort of other reinforcements was a bit of a pain. I wouldn't say it was on the same level as everything else, but it was still a bit of a nuisance. Also, shout out to Generic Sword Flyer in part 4 because that thing would not leave me the hell alone. And that became a whole nother thing of like positioning, and it was like akin to the same thing as Claude, but he had a Brave Sword, which means that even if Anna could take 1 hit, she sure wasn't taking 2. But then we get to part 5, and that had everything that made it just insane, because you had Dimitri, Edelgard, Lif, and Byleth. Oh yeah, and you had Claude too. And Claude was probably what made this map so much more toxic, because sure, I could deal with Lif and Dimitri, but Claude has stupid high range, which means that if I don't get rid of him, or have a means of just preventing him from killing, then there was no way in hell I was going to beat this map. Eventually it did work out, thankfully, because Vulture was actually quite useful here. I think this was probably the MVP weapon of the run, because there are so many instances where I shouldn't have survived, but I did, and I'm entirely grateful for the free gi that we got. But then Chapter 10 comes out, and we have Petra to deal with, and Petra, even without a refund, and even being mediocre for a while, is still going to kill the Askr trio, because yeah, we have no speed on most of our units. However, surprisingly, I had to use air in this instance. Even though I dropped her weapon, she had to bait out Petra and barely survive, so that way I can actually beat the map. And I don't know how it worked out like that, but it did. After that point, it was still just part 4 and part 5 that really gave me issues here. You had parts 2 and 3, which were whatever. It was still like the same old, but I don't think it was nearly to the same extent. Mainly because in part 4, the ranges are stupidly high, and there was only so much you could do without anybody just completely bodying you. Eventually, what I had to do was just throw Alphonse in, which I didn't really think about initially, because it was like, well, he can take hits, but he can only take it so much, right? No, he tanked it like a pretty big champ. I was very shocked. I was very, very shocked. And afterwards, Anna just cleared all the blue units, so that was cool. I think part 5 is what really threw me for a loop the most, because I learned this recently while doing this. You can kill anybody else on this map, but if you kill that sword fighter, that's when the reinforcements come. So after just struggling to deal with all of this stuff, I eventually came to the conclusion that why don't I just kill everything else and see what happens? Because I was killing other units, but reinforcements weren't showing up, and I had no idea why. And then I learned it after, like, who knows how long of experimentation. I don't know why they developed it like that, but I'm fine with it. Then we get into Chapter 11, and this one was also pretty tame for the most part. I think the only one that really gave me a run for my money was the positioning in Part 2, mainly because you had 2 overlapping cabs, which could easily make or break a lot of stuff, and then you had other reinforcements. So even if you could take on those other cabs, if you couldn't take on the rest of the units, you were probably screwed. And that's what I was struggling with for a bit, but otherwise it was still a relatively tame chapter, and it felt really nice because, well, the past few other chapters were a pain in the ass. So I'm fine with that. I'll take an easy chapter any day. After that point, we end up in chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 also started out relatively tame for the most part, although you'll see where I'm going with this again if you know anything about Book 3 or played Book 3. Everything was pretty par for the course. The only thing that may have been a pain in the ass at times was the blue mage, because there was one flyer with guidance, so no matter what your positioning was, they could always teleport in. Eventually I was able to work around it by getting some of the units away, in just positioning correctly. But part 5 was still a big pain because reinforcements, once again, and yeah, Python was a really big nuisance here because he could snipe air, he could pretty much kill Sharena. Alphonse was the only one just not taking his shit. But that doesn't change the fact that the reinforcements were just obscene, which is weird to say because it was a Leon and a Valbar and Conrad. I don't think that's like grounds for like absurdity in terms of just overall power. But when you consider the fact that I'm using the Askr trio of all units, maybe the power level maybe is greater than expected. Now, of course, I could have given them like super premium skills, but that's no fun. Also, I didn't have the bother and I don't want to really give it to them just for this one video, but I digress. I eventually did figure it out, which is perfectly fine because Anna thankfully does have speed, which means she was able to eat Python's hits for the time being, until I could get Alphonse in to just tank the rest and kill him. And then for the final chapter, this is where Air's movement came in a lot more handy because there are so many instances where I could just bait out mages, and she has good res despite just using Tamari. Yeah, it was pretty convenient. So what I was able to do for a majority of these parts was just go in, bait out with Air, or bait out with insert X unit that has good advantage against other unit, and it just worked out, thankfully. And even with stuff like Dual Ephraim with the guaranteed follow-up and stuff, Anna was still able to take it like champ because, you know, Lance Breaker and Triangle. He still did a fair amount, but it wasn't enough at the end of the day. And thankfully, it just worked out. Even in part 4, where that was like a big old lineup of like mess, where, you know, Dual Ephraim and Hell, and then the Blue Mage and all that stuff, yeah, it worked out pretty well. Especially since Air can go in, attack the save, and go from there. It wasn't too bad. But then we get to the final part of this run, and that's where everything kind of went to shit. There was no way in hell I was able to just deal with everything all at once. There was no singular unit that could just sit there and tank everything, because the color coverage was insane. So my initial thought was just, alright, let's bait out the red mage on the left side. That could work, right? No, Cormac spawns, and that kills everybody, because Air has no bulk. Eventually, I'm thinking, okay, what if I just do the same thing I did way back with Alphonse? Well, that could work until the Blue Mage kills. He can only take so many hits, even with Vulture, because he, at the end of the day, he doesn't really have good res, which sucks, because I was pretty much depending on that front. Eventually, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm not even using Quick Propose. I'm just gonna get rid of it. And that pretty much just saved the entire run, because I was able to do the same thing as before. I was able to take out a lot more units, like Garrick, which was nice. And because I was able to get solo, he was actually able to tank the Red Mage a lot better. And a lot of it just kind of fell into place afterward because there were just less enemies to deal with. So I had Air kill a mage, I had Sharena kill a dragon, and I had Alphonse deal with the Red Mage. And then eventually I was like, you know what, let me just do it for show-off purposes. I'll let Alphonse keep eating hits, and I'll get Sharena in. And what a way to close off the run with Sharena killing Hell. And that is Book 3 with the Askr Trio. So to answer the question, can they clear Book 3 by themselves? Yes, they can. Would I recommend it? No chance in hell.